Hi, I'm Ron Fein, the legal director at Free Speech for People, a national nonpartisan nonprofit. And along with our allies at the Center for American Progress and state and local partners around the country, we've helped develop legislation to ban corporate political spending by foreign-influenced companies. And in this video, I'm going to show you how using your own computer, you can determine to a reasonable degree of confidence which companies would qualify under this legislation. But first, let me briefly put on my lawyer hat and address a few preliminary legal and practical questions before we get into the brass tacks of how to determine which companies qualify. I'll see you in a few minutes. There are three U.S. Supreme Court decisions that govern this question. The first is Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission from 2010. In that case, the Supreme Court extended the right to spend money on elections to corporations, but with an important caveat. The court described the corporations to which its decision applied 3 times as associations of citizens, and it said specifically that it was not deciding any questions regarding companies that were funded by foreign investors. The second case, decided just a few years after Citizens United, although less well known, is Blumen versus Federal Election Commission. In that case, the Supreme Court upheld a decision from the lower courts written by Judge, now Justice, Brett Kavanaugh, in which Kavanaugh wrote that a law still in effect today that bans political spending of any amount by foreign entities directly in U.S. elections is constitutional and it can be justified because it helps protect American democratic self-government. The third decision, written by Justice Kavanaugh in 2020, is called U.S. Aid. And in that case, the Supreme Court held that foreign entities abroad have no constitutional rights whatsoever, and that associating themselves with U.S. entities or U.S. individuals doesn't give them the constitutional rights of those Americans. Putting these together, a corporation that has substantial foreign investment is not an association of citizens. And furthermore, the concerns about the threat to democratic self-government that Justice Kavanaugh identified apply. A wealthy foreign investor can't spend its own money directly in U.S. elections in any amount. So it follows that that same wealthy foreign investor can't buy a stake in a U.S. registered company and then leverage its influence in that company to affect how the corporation spends its treasury funds on U.S. elections. And that is why the bill that would ban political spending by foreign influenced companies is constitutional. Before we get started, let's talk about a couple of limitations to this method. First of all, it relies solely on publicly obtainable information. Some of this is from government sources, some of this is from private sources. The important point is that this is not how the companies themselves will determine who their investors are. Publicly traded corporations have more precise techniques for determining every shareholder and their address and how many shares they own. They do this at least once a year for their annual meetings, sometimes more often. In some cases, other shareholders can get access to this type of information, but it's not what the general public has. And so we're using lesser quality, lower detail sources, but that's okay for the purpose we're using them for, because this method is not intended for compliance or enforcement purposes. This is not a basis to say that a company is so definitely a foreign influence company that it must be violating the law if it's spending after this law has passed. Rather, this is intended for use with activists and legislators and maybe in op-eds, where you want to say, here's an example of the type of company that would be covered by this type of bill. Now, another issue is that this method, it doesn't have a lot of false positives, but it will have some false negatives. Now, on the false positive side, it's unlikely that if you run through this method and you find evidence that a company qualifies under the bill, it's unlikely that that would be a false positive. It could happen, but it's unlikely. What's more likely is that in some cases you won't be able to determine for sure that a company is foreign influenced. That doesn't mean it isn't. It just means that this method doesn't give you the evidence that it is. So we very rarely would say, oh, this company is definitely not foreign influenced. You wouldn't say that. You would just say, we don't have any evidence that it would qualify. And the last point is that the ownership of publicly traded companies changes on a regular basis. And that has a couple of different implications. For purposes of your analysis, what it can mean is that even the examples you'll see in this video between when I recorded them and when you might run through them for the exact same company, you might get different results. And that's totally normal. It also means that out there in the real world, a company might qualify as a foreign influence company in January, but by March it isn't, or the other way around, because foreign investors have bought or sold stock. And the practical implication of this for you is that if you are preparing materials for a legislator to review or for other purposes, and you ran an analysis on a company a couple of months ago, you want to rerun that analysis as if you hadn't done it and do it fresh because the data could be different. What it means for the way the law actually works once enacted is that the company is required to certify that it wasn't a foreign influence company on the day that it made a political contribution or expenditure. So they have a fixed date to look at. So those are the limitations to the method, and now we can get into the details. Here's a quick overview of how we're going to screen for foreign influence companies. We're going to start at cnbc.com. That company uses data sources that combine public and proprietary data to give some information about shareholder holdings. We're going to first see if the aggregate foreign ownership is 5% or more by looking at geographic concentration. Then we're going to look at the list of top institutional and mutual fund foreign investors to see if any of them hold 1% or more. We're going to double check on the MSN Finance or MSN Money website, which has some additional information. And then we'll talk about how you can know if an investor is foreign. And finally, I'll talk briefly about privately held companies. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to determine aggregate foreign ownership. So for example, if we wanted to do this for Uber, we would go to cnbc.com. We would look up Uber on its stock ticker website. We would scroll down to a list of tabs that's summary, news, profile, earnings, peers, financials, options, and ownership, and we would choose ownership. That would give us a geographic picture of where the shareholders are located. And you can see in this picture that Europe and Asia, and to some degree Africa and Australasia, together combined add up to well over 5%. So that triggers the 5% aggregate threshold. Now we're going to look at how we determine single 1% institutional investors. On that same screen on CNBC, you'll see top institutional holders, and that will give you a list of the top 10 largest single institutional investors. And some of them are pretty clearly foreign. So if you look at the bottom of this list, you'll see Morgan Stanley Investment Management of Singapore. That is not the Morgan Stanley that you might have in your neighborhood. That is the Singapore company. Some you need to know a little bit more about. You see Public Investment Fund. That is actually the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia. And you can, we'll talk a little bit later about how you can research any one of these to determine its foreign status. You'll also scroll down and you'll look at the list of top mutual fund investors. If you look at this list, you'll see next to bottom from the list with 1.2% of shares outstanding is Statens Pensjonsfond Utland, which the name itself suggests that it is not a US investor, and in fact it is a Norwegian mutual fund. We'll also look at the MSN, I guess it's MSN Money, not MSN Finance site, which lists some additional investors beyond the top 10. And we'll just make sure, sometimes you could have, let's say, 12 investors that all own 1% or more of stock. And although the CNBC site is in general superior, it only lists the top 10. So MSN Finance would go beyond that. Now, how do you know if an investor is foreign? So sometimes the investor's name gives it away, like if Singapore is in the name. In some cases, though, you need to look up the investor's own corporate website. So, for example, one investor you might see is Temasek Holdings. If you Google that, you'll see that its URL is not temasek.com, but temasek.com.sg. .sg means Singapore. Often a company will have a page on its website with a name like corporate governance or investors that will have that sort of company information, like where it is registered, where it holds its annual meetings, the laws of which country it's organized under. So usually the investor's own corporate website will give you information like that. Sometimes it can be tricky when you have a multinational conglomerate where there's holding companies and they all share one single website, and you're not totally clear from CNBC whether it's the US affiliate or the French conglomerate that has invested in an American company. So, at some point it can be tricky, but often it's not. The final point, though, is that you can build a convenient list of repeat players in this field because overall, there aren't that many foreign companies that tend to hold major stakes in S&P 500, for example, companies. Here are an example list of 4 that you'll see a lot, and once you know that they're foreign, you'll spot them right away. Now, what do you do about privately held companies? Here, it's much harder to get reliable information. Some of them are very open about it. There's really no question as to who owns them. You can find it on their own website or maybe even on Wikipedia. We don't want to totally rely on Wikipedia, but if Wikipedia makes it pretty clear that it's, for example, owned by one individual who's American, it's usually not worth contesting that. Some companies, especially LLCs in the real estate field, which are often formed to invest in one particular piece of property, it can be really difficult to find out their owners, which could, of course, be other LLCs, which then have their own investors. There is a new federal legislation that takes effect in 2024 that is supposed to bring some transparency to this. But in the meantime, it can be really hard to get information about privately held companies in some cases. And so at a certain point, it may not be worth chasing it down any further. Okay, now we're going to look at how to determine aggregate foreign ownership. So I'm going to cnbc.com. That's a site that has a finance lookup. And I'm going to go to this window right here where it says search quotes, news, and videos. And I'm going to start with Uber. I want to find out if Uber meets the threshold for aggregate foreign ownership. So I'm going to just type in the name of the company, and you'll see that it has different stock symbols here. And the right one here is the one that's just Uber on top. So when I click this, it's going to bring up some information for Uber Technologies Incorporated. That's the name of the company. Now, what I want to do is scroll down and come over here where it says ownership. And this is going to give me a nice geographic picture where it says shareholders concentration. Now, the first thing to know about this data is that it comes from a variety of public and not so public sources. And what you're going to see is that they list by continent with some idiosyncrasies. So, for example, they've grouped the US and Canada together as North America. And then they have Europe, Africa, Asia, Australasia, and then almost no data whatever for South Central America, in which they've inexplicably included Mexico. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at the attribution of foreign ownership to continents that definitely do not include the United States. So if we look here, we can see Europe has 7.2% of Uber stock, and Asia has 2.3%. So right there, that's 9.5%. Throw in 0.2% from Africa, 0.1% from Australasia, and you've got 9.8% of Uber stock at minimum is owned in foreign countries. Now, the reality is it's probably significantly higher than 9.8%. We just can only say with a reasonable degree of confidence that we know that it's at least 9.8%. Now, some of you may say, well, wait a second, it says North America is 58.3%. That should leave, over 40% unexplained. And the answer is that the data source that is being used to present this graph does not have full and complete data. So what you don't want to do, you do not want to focus on the North American percentage and then subtract that from 100 or anything like that. You want to just focus on what we can affirmatively say about other continents. In this case, we can say 9.8% of Uber stock, if not more, is owned in foreign countries, and therefore that's well above 5%. It easily meets the aggregate threshold for foreign ownership. I'm going to repeat this now with another company. So I go into search quotes and I'm going to type Amazon. And if you happen to know the stock ticker, you can just type that as an abbreviation. And here's Amazon Incorporated. And we're going to scroll down. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to go to ownership and we're going to see Amazon. Similar type of numbers right away. We've got 7.6% in Europe, 1% in Asia, 0.2% in Australasia. So that's 8.8% at least owned abroad. So Amazon would also meet the aggregate foreign ownership threshold. Now we're going to look for 1% individual foreign owners. When I say individual, I don't mean a human individual. I mean a single foreign investor. So let's go back to Uber. We're still at cnbc.com, and I'm going to search on Uber Technologies. So we're going to do the same thing where we scroll down to ownership. But instead of looking at the map, we're going to look at top institutional shareholders. And you'll see that Uber has one single foreign investor, actually two, that exceed 1% foreign ownership. Now, take a moment to look at this yourself, but only a moment. I don't know if you saw them, but I see at least two. So there's one that should be relatively easy, which is here. You can see Morgan Stanley Investment Management Singapore. That has the word Singapore in the name. That makes it pretty obvious. And you can see that that branch of Morgan Stanley Investment Management, the Singapore-based entity, owns 1.4% of shares. But also what you may not have noticed is Public Investment Fund. The full name of that is the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia. It's the Saudi government's sovereign oil wealth fund. It owns 3.6% of Uber. So it's always helpful if you can point out as many as possible single foreign investors that own 1% or more. Even if it triggers the 5% threshold, we like to identify particular 1% foreign investors. Here we've got two examples. Now I also want to show you, if you scroll down, there's this mutual fund holder list. Now we don't look at the people who own shares in the mutual funds. We just look at the mutual fund itself. And in this case, you can see there's one that's actually a foreign mutual fund. I'm not sure how to pronounce this in Norwegian, Statens Pensjonsfond Utland. It's a Norwegian pension fund, again, based on the country's sovereign oil wealth, and it owns 1.2% of the shares. So here we have three different foreign investors that each own 1% or more of Uber. And in addition, of course, to its aggregate 5% foreign ownership, that shows how they qualify. I want to show you another example here. Let's look at Morgan Stanley, the financial firm. Now, you may be wondering, how would you have known that Statens Pensionfond Utland or Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia are foreign funds? And the answer is, with time and with practice, you Google them and you find out what they are. Now, here, for example, for Morgan Stanley, you can see that 22.6% of its shares are owned by Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group Incorporated. Well, let's Google that and see what that is. And we can see just from the Google hits that it is a company based in Japan. So what that means is that it's a Japanese bank holding and financial service company headquartered in Chiyoda, Tokyo, Japan. So what that means is that Morgan Stanley is 22.6% owned by this particular foreign investor. And that's a great data point. We can also scroll down and see if we see anything obvious here in the mutual fund list. You can see that Statens Pensionfond Utland is in the sort of top 10 list, but it only has 0.7%. So that's not quite enough to qualify. A third example I want to show you is Chevron, the oil company. And again, if we were to look at its geographic ownership, we would see it easily meets that 5% aggregate threshold. When you look at its individual foreign investors, you might get a little excited down here when you see Norges Bank Investment Management. That's a different Norwegian bank, but it just barely misses the threshold right now, 0.9%. If you come back to this on a different day, maybe it'll be 1.0%. That can vary depending on whether they buy or sell stock. If you scroll down and look at the mutual funds, you will see, again, there's our friend Statens Pensionfond Utland, the other Norwegian fund, and it's also at 0.9%. So in this case, Chevron just barely doesn't seem to have an individual 1% foreign investor. So you can go through multiple examples like that. Sometimes you'll find a particular 1% foreign investor, sometimes you won't. And some of them stand out, they're pretty obvious, sometimes they're less obvious. So what this requires is that over time, as you do it, when you look up a company, you'll learn more about it. So now I want to give an example of one that's really not obvious to most people. So if you look up Excel, which is Excel Energy Company, you look through, you go to the ownership tab, and you look through its list of top shareholders, you might not notice any of these companies standing out as seeming foreign sounding. Now, if you look at MFS, Investment Management, and if you Google that, what you will find is that MFS Investment Management is an American-based global investment manager. Okay, so MFS Investment Management is itself American. I believe it used to stand for Massachusetts Financial Services. But when you research it further, you will find that its parent is Sun Life Financial, which is a Canadian insurance company. And under our policy, if a company like MFS is itself 50% or more owned by a definitely foreign company like Sun Life, the Canadian company, then we count that as a triggering foreign investment. So we would say that MFS Investment Management counts because, and I'm not going to walk through the full research on MFS and Sun Life here because it would make the video take too long, but MFS is a subsidiary of Sun Life. So what that means is that MFS's investment in this energy company, Excel Energy, is functionally Sun Life's investment in Xcel Energy. So we would say that Xcel Energy triggers it because it's 2.0% owned by MFS Investment Management, which is itself a 50% or more subsidiary of Sun Life, a Canadian company. I want to show you something else, which is that we don't want to rely only on CNBC because its data isn't necessarily the whole story. So here we are, we're looking at Xcel Energy. And if you recall, when you look at the list of the top institutional holders, it lists the top 10. And when you get down to number 10, it owns 1.3% of the shares of Xcel Energy. Well, what if the 11th largest institutional shareholder owns 1.2% and it's foreign? We would not know that from CNBC. So there's another website that we'll use sometimes to supplement the research, which is MSN Finance. So if you go to MSN Finance, the website is a little confusing because you'll see there's two different search windows. There's this one, which you don't want to use, and this one, which you do, where it says search stocks, ETFs, and more. So we're going to type Xcel Energy, and we're going to look at its investors. And if you scroll down, it's going to list the top shareholders. It may not have the exact same data as what you saw on CNBC, but it should be pretty close. And as we scroll down, we're going to see, well, this is interesting. I don't remember seeing the Royal Bank of Canada on the CNBC list, and it apparently owns 1.60%. And you can even click this See More. You'll scroll down, and we can see other companies that we may need to look up because we may need to see exactly where is Northern Trust, where is Legal and General. We can Google them. We see here Deutsche Bank. I don't know if that's officially a German company. We would need to look it up more detail, but we can see it's 0.97%. So it's just under the threshold. So the point is that by using MSN Finance, sometimes we can generate more investors than we would just by looking at CNBC. So when you're trying to put together the full picture of a company, use this website as well. Now I want to talk about some other companies that you might be thinking of and show you some of the limits of this method. So let's go back to CNBC. I think it's a better starting point. And let's look into In-N-Out Burger. It's a California-based fast food chain. And there are no suggested symbols for In-N-Out Burger. What does that mean? That means that In-N-Out Burger is not publicly traded. If we Google it, we'll find some information about it. And you can always start at Wikipedia. I wouldn't end there, but it's usually a decent starting point. And if you start reading the article, you'll see that the owner is actually the grandchild of the founders. So this is a privately held company, and there's no reason to suspect that Lindsay Snyder is not a US citizen. So we're going to say that we don't have any evidence to believe that In-N-Out Burger would qualify. Well, let's look at Koch Industries, because that's a company that a lot of people have concerns about. And we can see a lot of articles about it, but there's no stock ticker symbol for it because, again, that's not publicly traded. And when we Google it, we're going to see, oh, we can already see even from this preview, it is the second largest privately held company in the United States. So you can't buy stock in Koch Industries even if you want to. And what you will see if you read about it is that there are different descendants of the original founders that own various percentages. So unless you have some reason to believe that one of these is not a US citizen, then Koch Industries is not going to qualify as a foreign influenced company. So this method sometimes requires you to look more deeply into particular companies in order to find evidence about them. Now, one last example you might wonder about is sometimes you end up actually finding a company that is itself foreign. So I'm just going to give an example of Novartis, which is a pharmaceutical company. So how would you know whether Novartis is a US company or not? It's very global. So when you go to its website, and every company has a different way that they organize their website, but usually they're going to have something somewhere on their website where they have a link for investors. It might be about the corporation, it might be investors, but this is going to have some information. And here you can see their fourth quarter and full year results and annual report. And I can already see Basel, Switzerland. Well, that's a little weird because US companies don't base their annual report in Basel, Switzerland. And you can see the investors' event calendar, again, Basel, Switzerland. And if you go through and read some of these documents that are intended for investors, you will quickly learn that Novartis is in fact a Swiss company. So that means that it's not even a question of being a foreign influenced company. It is a foreign company. It is actually already prohibited under federal law from spending in elections. What our legislation will make it do is that companies in which Novartis takes a stake, Novartis buys 1% of some other company, then that company is unable to spend money in US elections as well.